The golden sunset painted the rugged Montana mountains with streaks of amber and purple as Ethan Blackwood stood on the edge of his failing ranch, eyes fixed on the horizon. 15 years of backbreaking work had left permanent calluses on his hands and deep lines etched across his weathered face. At 39, he'd given everything to this land, but after 3 seasons of relentless drought, the Blackwood Ranch was hanging by a thread. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. One more season, he whispered to himself, the cool evening breeze carrying his words across the empty fields. That's all I've got left. The distant whinny of his prize stallion, Thunder, pulled Ethan from his thoughts. He turned away from the sunset and walked toward the barn, his shoulders heavy with the weight of impending loss. Unbeknownst to him, fate was galloping toward Blackwood Ranch, in the form of a determined young woman with nothing to lose and everything to prove. Ethan's boots crunched against the dry earth as he made his way back to the ranch house. The structure stood like a lone sentinel against the vast Montana landscape, windows dark and uninviting. He'd built this place with his father before the old man passed, dreaming of filling it with family and laughter. Now it was just him, a few ranch hands who came by day, and the ghosts of what might have been. Inside, Ethan lit a single lamp and settled at the worn kitchen table, spreading out the ranch's financial documents. The numbers hadn't changed since yesterday, or the day before, but he studied them anyway, as if through sheer will he could make them tell a different story. The bank's final notice lay at the center of the papers, its message clear: 3 months to turn things around or lose everything. Thunder's anxious neigh pierced the night again, louder this time. Something was wrong. Ethan grabbed his coat and lantern, heading back into the night air. The temperature had dropped sharply, and the first drops of a spring storm pelted his face as he hurried toward the stables. "Easy, boy," he called as he approached Thunder's stall. The magnificent black stallion was pacing nervously, ears pinned back. Ethan raised his lantern, casting light across the stable floor. That's when he noticed the blood. What the hell? Following the trail of dark droplets, Ethan moved deeper into the barn. The sound of labored breathing drew him to the last stall, where Thunder's yearling colt, Midnight, lay on his side, a deep gash running down his right front leg. Beside him, huddled against the wall, was a figure Ethan didn't recognize. "Who's there?" Ethan demanded, raising the lantern higher. A young woman looked up, her hands covered in blood and her face streaked with dirt and tears. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a messy braid, and her clothes were soaked through from the rain. Despite her disheveled appearance, her eyes blazed with determination. "I found him caught in barbed wire by the creek," she said, her voice steady despite her obvious exhaustion. "He would have bled out if I'd left him there." Ethan stepped into the stall, kneeling beside his injured colt. The wound was deep, but had been carefully cleaned and partly bandaged with strips of fabric that looked to be torn from the woman's own shirt. "You did this?" he asked, gesturing to the makeshift bandage. "My father was a veterinarian," she explained, sitting back on her heels. "I helped him since I was old enough to hold a suture needle." Ethan studied her face in the lantern light. She couldn't be more than 25, but there was a weariness in her eyes that spoke of hardships beyond her years. "You need proper medical supplies," she continued, seemingly unfazed by his scrutiny. "And antibiotics, if you have them. The wound needs stitching, or he might not make it through the night." "I've got a medical kit in the house," Ethan said, standing. "What's your name?" "Abigail Foster." She didn't offer more, and Ethan didn't ask. "I'll get the supplies. Stay with him." By the time Ethan returned with his medical kit, the storm had intensified, rain hammering against the barn roof like 1,000 tiny fists. Abigail hadn't moved from Midnight's side, her hand gently stroking the colt's neck, whispering words Ethan couldn't hear over the storm. Together, they worked through the night. Ethan held the lantern steady as Abigail's nimble fingers stitched the jagged wound with precision that spoke of years of practice. She worked with quiet efficiency, only speaking to ask for different supplies or to instruct Ethan on how to better position the light. As dawn broke, casting pale gray light through the barn windows, Midnight was resting comfortably, his breathing even and strong. Abigail sat back against the stall wall, exhaustion finally claiming her. Her hands were stained with dried blood, and dark circles shadowed her eyes. "You saved his life," Ethan said, breaking the silence that had settled between them. Not many people would have stopped for a stray colt, let alone spent the night saving him. Abigail shrugged, her gaze fixed on the sleeping animal. "I couldn't just leave him there." "Where were you headed?" Ethan asked, realizing he hadn't questioned why she was crossing his property in the middle of a storm. A guarded expression crossed her face. "Nowhere in particular. Just passing through." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Ethan recognized the look of someone running from something, or someone. He'd seen it enough times in his own mirror after returning from the war. "Well, you've earned yourself breakfast at least," he said, standing and offering his hand. "And a chance to clean up." Abigail hesitated before taking his hand and allowing him to pull her to her feet. "I should keep moving," she said, though her eyes betrayed her exhaustion. "The storm's not letting up any time soon," Ethan countered, nodding toward the barn door where rain continued to pour. "And you've been up all night. Food, rest, then you can be on your way if that's what you want." Inside the ranch house, Ethan quickly became aware of how long it had been since he'd had a visitor. Dishes were piled in the sink, and dust had settled on most surfaces. If Abigail noticed, she didn't comment, sinking gratefully into a chair at the kitchen table, while he stoked the wood stove and put coffee on to boil. "Been a while since I had company," he said by way of apology as he cleared papers from the table. "I'm not much for judging," Abigail replied, pushing a damp strand of hair from her face. "A roof and hot coffee puts you miles ahead of where I spent the last few nights." Ethan paused in his movements, studying her again. Despite her bedraggled appearance, there was a quiet dignity in the way she held herself. This wasn't a woman accustomed to hardship. This was someone who had been thrust into it recently. "Bathrooms down the hall if you want to clean up," he offered. "Might be able to find you some dry clothes, too." While Abigail washed, Ethan scrambled eggs and fried bacon, his mind turning over the strange circumstances that had brought this mysterious woman to his door. By the time she returned, her face clean and hair neatly braided, wearing an old flannel shirt of his that hung to her knees, he had breakfast on the table. "I didn't realize how hungry I was," Abigail admitted as she ate with controlled urgency, the kind that suggested she wasn't sure when her next meal would come. "Hard work builds an appetite," Ethan replied, pouring her more coffee. "And saving a horse is hard work." A small smile touched her lips, the first he'd seen. It transformed her face, softening the wariness in her eyes for just a moment. "How long have you had him? Midnight, I mean." "Born here last spring," Ethan said, pride warming his voice. "His sire, Thunder, is the best stallion in the county. I had high hopes for Midnight carrying on his bloodline." "He still can," Abigail assured him. "The wound was deep, but clean. With proper care, he should heal completely." Ethan nodded, grateful for her confidence. "Speaking of care, I should check on him." He stood, gathering their empty plates. "You're welcome to rest here. Spare bedroom's first door on the right." "I can help," Abigail insisted, rising too. "I should change his bandages anyway." Ethan didn't argue. They returned to the barn together, the rain having finally slowed to a gentle patter. Midnight was awake, attempting to stand when they entered the stall. Abigail rushed forward, steadying the wobbly colt. "Easy now," she murmured, her hands gentle but firm on his flank. "You're not ready for dancing just yet." For the next hour, Ethan watched in amazement as Abigail tended to Midnight with the expertise of a seasoned veterinarian. She cleaned the wound again, applied a salve from Ethan's medical kit, and rewrapped the leg with fresh bandages. "Where did you learn all this?" he asked as they walked back to the house, the clouds finally parting to reveal patches of blue sky. Abigail's expression clouded. "Like I said, my father was a vet. I worked with him until—" She trailed off, then straightened her shoulders. "Until I couldn't anymore." Ethan sensed the story behind those words but didn't press. Everyone had the right to their secrets. The war had given him plenty of his own. "Well, your father taught you well," he said instead. "I'd have lost that colt without you." Back at the house, exhaustion finally caught up with Abigail. Despite her protest that she could help around the ranch, Ethan insisted she rest. When she finally relented, he showed her to the spare room, promising to wake her if Midnight's condition changed. While Abigail slept, Ethan returned to his financial paperwork, though his mind kept drifting to the enigmatic woman under his roof. There was something about her competence, her quiet determination that reminded him of his mother, a woman who had faced the harshest Montana winters with unbreakable resolve. The sound of a vehicle approaching pulled Ethan from his thoughts. Through the window, he saw Sheriff Mike Dawson's patrol car coming up the drive. Cursing under his breath, Ethan went out to meet him, pulling the door closed quietly behind him. "Mike," he greeted the sheriff, a man he'd known since childhood. "What brings you out this way?" Sheriff Dawson removed his hat, revealing salt and pepper hair cropped short. "Got a missing persons report I'm following up on," he said, his tone professional but friendly. "Young woman, auburn hair, mid-20s. Name's Abigail Foster. Her stepfather reported her missing 3 days ago." Ethan kept his expression neutral, though his pulse quickened. "That so?" The sheriff nodded, pulling out a photograph. "This is her. Stepfather says she took off after an argument. He's worried sick." Ethan glanced at the photo. It was unmistakably Abigail, though the woman in the picture looked markedly different. Hair perfectly styled, wearing an expensive dress, smiling a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Nothing like the determined, dirt-streaked woman who had spent the night saving his colt. "Can't say I've seen her," Ethan said, handing the photo back, "but I'll keep an eye out." Sheriff Dawson studied him for a moment. "Her stepfather's Harrison Wells, big-time lawyer from Bozeman. Says she might be emotionally unstable." Ethan's jaw tightened. The Abigail he'd met might be many things, but unstable wasn't one of them. "Like I said, I haven't seen her. But if I do, I'll let you know." After the sheriff left, Ethan stood on the porch, watching the patrol car disappear down the long driveway. He just lied to a lawman, something he'd never done before. Yet something in his gut told him he'd made the right call. "You didn't tell him I was here." Ethan turned to find Abigail standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "Figured you had your reasons for running," he replied simply. Abigail stepped onto the porch, wrapping his oversized shirt tighter around herself against the cool afternoon breeze. "Harrison Wells is not my stepfather," she said after a long moment. "He was my father's business partner. After Dad died 6 months ago, Harrison took control of the veterinary practice. And then he decided he should take control of me too." "He hurt you?" Ethan asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Not physically," Abigail clarified, "but he made it clear that our arrangement would be the only way I could stay connected to my father's legacy." Her voice hardened. "I left the night he had all of Dad's research moved to his house without telling me. 15 years of work on equine respiratory diseases gone. When I confronted him, he said I should be grateful he was willing to marry a woman with so little to offer." Ethan felt a surge of anger on her behalf. "So you ran." "I took what was mine, Dad's medical bag and his journals, and left," she confirmed. "I've been making my way west for 3 days. I have an aunt in Oregon who doesn't know Harrison. I was cutting across country to avoid the main roads when I found your colt." They stood in silence for a moment, the only sound the distant lowing of cattle and the soft spring breeze rustling through the pines. "Well," Ethan finally said, "seems to me Midnight's injury was a stroke of luck for both of you." Abigail looked at him questioningly. "That colt needs a proper vet to ensure he heals right," Ethan explained. "And I can't afford to bring one out here, not with the ranch finances the way they are." "I'm not a licensed veterinarian," Abigail pointed out, "but you know more than enough to help that colt," Ethan countered. "And I've got a barn full of horses and cattle that could use looking after." He paused, then added more softly, "Plus it's a long way to Oregon. Might be smart to let your trail go cold before continuing on." Abigail considered his words, her gaze drifting toward the barn where Midnight rested. "You'd let me stay?" even knowing Harrison is looking for me? Harrison Wells has no authority here, Ethan said firmly. This is Blackwood Ranch. My land. My rules. He extended his hand to her. What do you say? You help me with the animals. I provide room, board, and a place to lay low for a while. Abigail studied his face, searching for any sign of deception. Finding none, she took his hand. Deal. The next morning, Ethan awoke to the smell of coffee and the sound of movement in his kitchen. For a disorienting moment, he thought he was dreaming, then remembered his unexpected houseguest. Pulling on a clean shirt, he made his way down the hall to find Abigail at the stove, expertly flipping pancakes. Hope you don't mind, she said, glancing over her shoulder. I wanted to earn my keep. Mind? I can't remember the last time I had pancakes for breakfast, Ethan admitted, pouring himself coffee from the pot she'd brewed. I checked on midnight at dawn, Abigail continued, sliding a stack of pancakes onto a plate. His fever's down, and he's putting a little weight on the leg. Good signs. They settled at the table, the morning sun streaming through the windows, casting the kitchen in a warm glow that made the dusty surfaces and worn furniture seem almost charming rather than neglected. After breakfast, I thought you could show me around, Abigail suggested between bites. If I'm going to help with the animals, I should know what I'm working with. Ethan nodded, suddenly aware of how different the day ahead looked compared to his usual solitary routine. I'd like that. As they finished breakfast, Ethan found himself studying Abigail again. In the morning light, with a night's rest behind her, she looked younger, more vibrant. There was a quiet determination in the set of her shoulders that spoke of a woman who knew her own mind. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Ethan felt a flicker of something that might have been hope. One injured colt and a runaway vet's daughter were hardly enough to save his failing ranch, but as he watched Abigail clear their plates with efficient movements, he couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, this unexpected twist of fate might be the beginning of something new. For the next 2 weeks, Abigail settled into life at Blackwood Ranch with surprising ease. Each morning she rose before dawn to check on Midnight, whose recovery continued to exceed expectations. By the end of the first week, the colt was putting weight on his injured leg, and by the second, he was hobbling around his stall, eager to join the other horses in the pasture. Not yet, impatient one, Abigail murmured, stroking the colt's velvet nose as she changed his bandages. Another week at least. Ethan watched from the barn doorway, a cup of coffee in his weathered hands. There was something about the way Abigail worked with the animals that captivated him. She moved with quiet confidence, her touch gentle but sure, speaking to them in low, soothing tones that seemed to calm even the most skittish mare. You have a gift, he remarked as she emerged from Midnight's stall. Abigail brushed hay from her borrowed jeans, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. It's not a gift, just practice and patience. My father always said animals can sense fear and uncertainty. If you're calm, they're calm. Your father sounds like a wise man. A shadow crossed her face. He was. Over breakfast each morning, they developed a routine of discussing the day's tasks. Ethan found himself increasingly relying on Abigail's input, especially regarding the health of his livestock. Years of barely scraping by had forced him to neglect preventative care, and Abigail quickly identified several issues that needed addressing. Your cattle need proper mineral supplements, she told him on the 10th day, making notes in a journal she'd started keeping. And at least 3 of your mares show signs of worm infestation. It's manageable now, but left untreated. I know, Ethan sighed, running a hand through his dark hair, now streaked with premature silver at the temples. But medicine costs money. Money I don't have. Abigail looked up from her notes, studying his face. In the short time she'd been at Blackwood Ranch, she'd pieced together the dire financial situation, though Ethan rarely spoke of it directly. What if we could make some? She suggested. Money doesn't grow on the pine trees around here, last I checked, Ethan replied with a wry smile. No, but there might be other ways. Abigail flipped through her father's journal, stopping at a dog-eared page. My father developed his own formulations for common livestock ailments. Less expensive than commercial options, but just as effective. I could make some, if you have the basic supplies. Ethan leaned forward, interest piqued. What would you need? By that afternoon, they'd driven into the small town of Pine Ridge, 20 miles from the ranch. Ethan was uncharacteristically nervous as they walked into the general store. Aware of the curious glances from locals who rarely saw him with company, let alone a young woman. Ethan Blackwood, called Martha Jenkins from behind the counter, her weathered face breaking into a smile. Twice in 1 month. Must be some kind of record. Supplies couldn't wait, Martha, Ethan replied, nodding toward Abigail. This is Abigail Foster. She's helping me with the livestock for a while. Martha's keen eyes took in Abigail's borrowed clothes, and the way she stayed slightly behind Ethan, as if uncomfortable with the attention. Welcome to Pine Ridge, dear. Any friend of Ethan's is a friend of ours. As they gathered the ingredients from Abigail's list, Ethan noticed Sheriff Dawson's patrol car parked outside the diner across the street. Let's make this quick, he murmured to Abigail, who had already spotted the vehicle, her posture tensing. They were nearly finished when the bell above the door jingled, and a man in an expensive suit walked in, looking distinctly out of place among the feed bags and work boots. Ethan felt Abigail freeze beside him, her hand gripping his arm with surprising strength. That's Harrison, she whispered, her face draining of color. Ethan assessed the newcomer quickly. Harrison Wells was in his 40s, with carefully styled dark hair and the smooth, confident bearing of a man accustomed to getting his way. He approached the counter, smiling warmly at Martha. Good afternoon, he said, his voice smooth as polished stone. I'm looking for information about a missing young woman. He produced a photograph from his pocket. My stepdaughter, Abigail. She's been missing for nearly 3 weeks now, and we're desperate to find her. Ethan felt a surge of protective anger at the false concern in the man's voice. Without thinking, he stepped slightly in front of Abigail, shielding her from view. I haven't seen anyone matching that description, Martha said, studying the photo, but I can put up a notice on our community board if you'd like. That would be very helpful, Harrison replied, handing over the photo along with what appeared to be a business card. There's a substantial reward for information leading to her safe return. She's not well. Mentally, I mean. Her father's death hit her hard. At this, Ethan felt Abigail stiffen behind him. He shifted, casually moving toward the back door of the store. Martha, we'll pick up the rest next time, he called over his shoulder. Left my wallet in the truck. Outside, Ethan guided Abigail quickly to his battered pickup, parked thankfully out of sight of the store's front windows. Keep your head down, he instructed as they drove past the sheriff's car. Neither spoke until they were well outside town limits. He's here, Abigail finally said, her voice small. He followed me all the way to Montana. Seems he wants to find you pretty badly, Ethan observed, glancing at her pale face. It's not me he wants, she replied bitterly. It's my father's research. Harrison needs my signature to fully take over the practice and patents. Without it, there's a chance my father's old partners could contest his control. Ethan's hands tightened on the steering wheel. So all this concern about your mental state is his way of ensuring no one believes me if I contest his story. Abigail stared out the window at the passing landscape. If he convinces everyone I'm unstable with grief, he can petition for guardianship. He already tried before I left. The implications sank in, fueling Ethan's anger. You can't leave the ranch until he's gone, he stated firmly. It's not safe. Abigail turned to him, her expression softening. I've already imposed on you too much. If Harrison realizes I'm staying with you, he could make trouble. Legal trouble. Let him try, Ethan replied with quiet determination. This is my land. My rules, remember? The smile she gave him then, small but genuine, stirred something in Ethan's chest he'd thought long buried. A desire to protect, yes, but something more. Something that made him suddenly very aware of the setting sun painting her auburn hair with gold, and the way her eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when she smiled. Back at the ranch, they worked together to create the remedies from Abigail's father's journal. The kitchen transformed into a makeshift laboratory, with jars of herbs and minerals lining the counters. Ethan watched in fascination as Abigail measured and mixed with precise movements, explaining the purpose of each ingredient. This one will help with the worm infestation, she said, holding up a jar of murky liquid. And this paste is for Thunder's cracked hooves. Much better than what you've been using. How can you be sure they'll work? Ethan asked, not doubtfully but with genuine curiosity. Abigail's expression grew distant, focused on memories. We tested everything extensively. Dad was meticulous about documentation. These formulations saved countless animals when their owners couldn't afford commercial treatments. Pride colored her voice. He could have made a fortune selling them to pharmaceutical companies, but he believed medicine should be accessible to everyone, not just those who could pay premium prices. Sounds like my kind of man, Ethan said softly. They fell into a comfortable silence as they worked, the only sounds the bubbling of mixtures on the stove, and the distant lowing of cattle being brought in for the night by Miguel, Ethan's only regular ranch hand. Later that evening, after a simple dinner, they sat on the porch watching fireflies dance against the darkening sky. Ethan had opened a rare bottle of whiskey, pouring small glasses for each of them. "To your father," he said, raising his glass, "and his healing remedies." Abigail clinked her glass against his. "And to midnight, who's the reason I found this place." The whiskey burned pleasantly down Ethan's throat, warming him from the inside. Or perhaps the warmth came from the woman sitting beside him, her presence somehow making his weathered porch seem less lonely than it had in years. "Can I ask you something?" Abigail said after a comfortable silence. "Shoot. How did you end up running this ranch alone? You mentioned your father built it with you, but—" Ethan stared into his glass, watching the amber liquid catch the light from the kitchen window. "Dad died 10 years ago. Heart attack while mending fences on the North Ridge. Mom followed 2 years later." He took another sip before continuing. "I had a brother once. Younger. Michael. He was the smart one. Went off to college while I stayed to work the ranch with Dad." Abigail waited patiently as he gathered his thoughts. Michael joined the army after graduation. Military intelligence. He died in Afghanistan during my second tour. "You served too?" Abigail asked softly. Ethan nodded. 8 years. 2 tours. Came back to find the ranch struggling and Mom sick with cancer. After she passed, it was just me. He gestured to the vast, dark expanse beyond the porch light. Just me, and 5,000 acres I couldn't bear to sell and couldn't properly maintain. Abigail's hand found his in the gathering darkness, her touch light but grounding. "I'm sorry about your family." "Been a long time," Ethan replied, though the gentle pressure of her fingers against his palm eased something tight in his chest. "But thank you." The next morning brought a flurry of activity as they began treating the animals with Abigail's remedies. Ethan was skeptical at first, but watching her work, confident and sure in a way she hadn't been since arriving, he found his doubt fading. "We should see improvement in the mares within days," Abigail explained as they walked back to the house for lunch. "And Midnight might be ready for short, supervised walks by next week." "You've done more for this ranch in 2 weeks than I've managed in 2 years," Ethan admitted as they washed up at the kitchen sink, their shoulders nearly touching in the small space. Abigail shook her head. "You've been doing the work of 3 men, from what I can see. There's only so much one person can handle alone." The phone rang before Ethan could respond, its shrill tone rarely heard in the quiet house. He answered with a cautious, "Blackwood Ranch." The color drained from his face as he listened to the caller. "When?" he asked tersely. "How many?" Another pause. "I'll be right there." He hung up, already reaching for his hat and keys. "That was Miguel. 4 of our cattle are down at the north fence line, showing signs of poisoning." "Poisoning?" Abigail repeated, alarmed. "From what?" "Could be they got into something toxic. Could be the water source is contaminated. Either way, I need to get out there fast." "I'm coming with you," Abigail stated, grabbing her father's medical bag. "If it's poisoning, they'll need immediate treatment." They raced to Ethan's truck, driving at breakneck speed down rutted ranch roads until they reached the north pasture. Miguel was there with another ranch hand, trying to keep the affected cattle separate from the rest of the herd. Abigail was out of the truck before it fully stopped, medical bag in hand. The scene was grim. 4 cows lay on their sides, breathing laboriously, foam gathering at their mouths. Water hemlock, she diagnosed after a quick examination. See these symptoms? Excessive salivation, muscle tremors, difficulty breathing. They must have eaten it recently, within the last hour or two. Water hemlock? Ethan repeated. That doesn't grow in this pasture. Someone would have had to bring it in, Miguel said grimly. These cows were fine at morning check. The implication hung heavily in the air. Someone had deliberately poisoned Ethan's cattle. Abigail was already mixing a treatment from her father's bag, her movements quick but precise. I can try to save them, but we need to act fast. And we need to find the source, before more animals are affected. For the next 2 hours, they worked tirelessly. Abigail administered her treatment to each animal, while Ethan and the ranch hands combed the pasture, eventually finding a cluster of water hemlock plants that had been deliberately placed near the water trough. Who would do this? Miguel asked, helping Ethan carefully remove and bag the toxic plants. Ethan's jaw tightened. Someone who wants to make sure this ranch fails. By sunset, they had managed to save 3 of the 4 cattle, a success Abigail attributed to catching the poisoning early. Exhausted, they returned to the ranch house, both covered in dirt and various bodily fluids from their efforts. Go shower, Ethan told her as they trudged up the porch steps. I'll make dinner. When Abigail emerged from the bathroom, hair damp and wearing another of Ethan's flannel shirts as a makeshift nightgown, she found him on the phone, his expression thunderous. This is the 3rd incident this month, Mike, he was saying, pacing the kitchen floor. First the cut fence lines, then the damaged irrigation pump, now poisoned cattle. Someone's targeting my ranch. Abigail's stomach clenched. She waited until he hung up before speaking. You've had other problems before I arrived. Ethan nodded, running a hand through his hair in frustration. Started about 6 months ago. Small things at first. Equipment moved. Gates left open. Then escalated. Sheriff Dawson doesn't believe you? He believes me, Ethan sighed, sinking into a kitchen chair. But without evidence pointing to a specific person, there's not much he can do except increase patrols. Abigail joined him at the table, her mind racing. You said the bank gave you 3 months to turn things around. Who benefits if you fail? Lots of people want this land, Ethan admitted. Developers mostly. There's been talk of a resort complex in the valley. My ranch sits on the prime parcel, with water rights to boot. So someone's trying to sabotage you, Abigail said quietly. Make sure you can't meet the bank's deadline. Their eyes met across the table, and Abigail was struck by the weariness in Ethan's gaze, but also the steely determination that seemed to be his defining characteristic. They'll have to try harder than this, he said, a hint of that military resolve showing through. I don't give up easy. Abigail reached across the table, covering his calloused hand with her own. Neither do I. Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition of shared battles, different though they might be. Harrison's pursuit, the sabotage of Ethan's ranch, both fighting to hold on to what mattered most to them. We should eat, Ethan said finally, though he made no move to withdraw his hand from beneath hers. Tomorrow will be another long day. The following morning, they awoke to the sound of a vehicle coming up the drive. Ethan was on the porch before Abigail made it to the kitchen, his posture tense as he watched Sheriff Dawson's patrol car approach. Stay inside, he told her when she appeared at the door, just in case. Abigail nodded, retreating to the kitchen but positioning herself to hear the conversation through the screen door. Morning, Ethan, Sheriff Dawson greeted, removing his hat as he climbed the porch steps. Got a minute? If this is about yesterday's incident, I've got the plants bagged for evidence, Ethan replied. It's not just that, the sheriff said, his expression grave. Got a call from a Mr. Harrison Wells this morning. Says he has reason to believe you're harboring his stepdaughter. Ethan's face remained impassive. Is that so? He's staying at the Pine Ridge Inn, very insistent that he speak with you. The sheriff studied Ethan's face. Says his stepdaughter might be confused, might have told you stories about him that aren't true. And what do you think, Mike? Ethan asked quietly. Sheriff Dawson sighed, looking out over the ranch. I think I've known you since we were kids, and I've never known you to lie to me. I also think that Mr. Wells strikes me as the type of man who's used to getting his way. He turned back to Ethan. If you do happen to know where Miss Foster is, you might want to suggest she speak to a lawyer. Preferably one not from Bozeman, where Mr. Wells seems to have considerable influence. The message was clear. The sheriff suspected Abigail was at the ranch, but wasn't going to force the issue. "Appreciate the advice," Ethan said carefully. "And the heads up." After the sheriff left, Abigail emerged onto the porch, her face pale but resolute. "He knows I'm here." "Suspects," Ethan corrected. "But he's not going to drag you out in handcuffs." He turned to her, his expression serious. "But Harrison knowing you're in the area complicates things. If he's connected to the sabotage—" "You think he could be behind it?" Abigail asked, alarmed. "Why would he care about your ranch?" "I don't know," Ethan admitted, "but the timing is suspicious. And a man willing to declare his stepdaughter mentally unstable for financial gain isn't someone I'd put past other forms of manipulation." They spent the day on high alert, checking and rechecking the property for any signs of tampering. Ethan insisted on accompanying Abigail to the barn when she went to treat midnight, unwilling to let her out of his sight with Harrison so close. As they worked side by side, tending to the animals with a new sense of urgency, Ethan found himself increasingly aware of Abigail's presence. The way she hummed softly to herself while mixing remedies, the gentle strength in her hands as she examined a foal with a mild cough, the determination in her eyes when she spoke of saving the ranch's struggling livestock. In just over 2 weeks, she had become essential to Blackwood Ranch. And, though he was hardly ready to admit it aloud, essential to him as well. That night, they sat at the kitchen table with mugs of coffee, maps of the ranch spread between them as they strategized improved security measures. "We need to check the water sources daily," Abigail suggested, marking locations on the map, "and maybe set up some kind of alarm system at key entry points." Ethan nodded, adding his own notes. "Miguel can take the South Ridge. I'll handle the northern boundary. And I'll monitor the animals for any signs of distress," Abigail added. "Early detection saved those cattle yesterday. It could make the difference again." Their hands brushed as they both reached for a pencil, and Ethan found himself lingering in the contact, struck by how natural it felt to plan the ranch's future with her, as if she had always been meant to be part of it. "Abigail," he began, his voice rougher than intended, "I know you're planning to head to Oregon once things settle down, but—" A sharp crack echoed through the night, cutting off his words. Both of them froze, instantly recognizing the sound of a rifle shot. "The barn," Ethan said, already moving toward the door where his shotgun stood ready. "Stay here." "Not a chance," Abigail replied, grabbing a heavy flashlight. "Midnight's in there." Together, they rushed into the darkness toward the barn, where frightened whinnies and the thundering of hooves against stall doors told them the horses were in a panic. As they approached, a figure darted from the barn's side door, racing toward a vehicle parked just beyond the paddock fence. "Hey!" Ethan shouted, raising his shotgun but not firing, unwilling to risk hitting anything or anyone in the darkness. The figure jumped into the waiting car, which sped away down the ranch road, lights off. Ethan caught only a glimpse of a dark SUV before it disappeared into the night. Inside the barn, they found chaos. The horses were frantic, several having kicked their stall doors in panic. A bullet hole in the roof explained the gunshot, but more concerning was the empty can lying in the center aisle. Kerosene, its contents spilled across the hay-strewn floor. "They were going to burn it down," Abigail whispered, horrified, "with the animals inside." Ethan's face hardened with cold fury as he surveyed the scene. But something spooked them, made them fire the shot and run. He turned to Abigail, his expression grave. "This is escalating too quickly. I need to get you somewhere safe." "No," Abigail said firmly, already moving to calm the nearest horse. "I'm not running again. Not from Harrison. Not from this." She faced him, her eyes reflecting the determination he'd come to admire. "This is your home, Ethan. And these animals need us, both of us." In that moment, watching her stand resolute in the face of danger, something shifted irrevocably in Ethan's heart. This woman, who had appeared on his doorstep with nothing but courage and skill, had somehow become the one thing he couldn't bear to lose. "All right," he said finally, "we stand our ground. Together." They spent the next hour securing the barn and calming the animals. When they finally returned to the house, exhausted but vigilant, Ethan made a call to Sheriff Dawson, reporting the incident in detail. Then, as an extra precaution, he retrieved his military-issue sidearm from the gun safe, checking it thoroughly before setting it on his bedside table. "Try to get some sleep," he told Abigail as they stood in the hallway between their bedrooms. "I'll keep watch for a while." Instead of retreating to her room, Abigail stepped closer, her hand coming to rest lightly on his chest. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything. For believing in me when no one else did." Before Ethan could respond, she rose on her tiptoes and pressed a gentle kiss to his cheek, her lips warm against his stubbled skin. Then she was gone, disappearing into the spare room, leaving Ethan standing in the hallway, one hand unconsciously touching the spot where her lips had been. Something fundamental had changed at Blackwood Ranch, and for the first time in years, Ethan found himself hoping for a future beyond mere survival. The morning after the attempted barn burning, Ethan woke to the aroma of coffee and the sound of Abigail's voice drifting through the house. Following it to the kitchen, he found her on the phone, her posture tense as she paced the worn linoleum floor. "Yes, Ms. Reynolds." "I understand the risk," she was saying, her free hand fidgeting with a pen. "But if my father's research falls into Harrison's hands—" She paused, listening. "Tomorrow morning would be perfect. Thank you." She hung up, turning to find Ethan in the doorway. The morning light streaming through the windows caught the auburn highlights in her hair, momentarily distracting him from the worry etched on her face. "Everything okay?" he asked, accepting the mug of coffee she offered. That was Caroline Reynolds. She was my father's attorney before he died. Abigail leaned against the counter, cradling her own mug. "I've been trying to reach her for weeks. She's agreed to meet us in Bozeman tomorrow to discuss legal options against Harrison." "Us?" Ethan raised an eyebrow. Abigail's cheeks colored slightly. "I hope that's okay. I just thought, after last night, we might both benefit from legal advice. The sabotage, Harrison's pursuit. It seems connected somehow." Ethan nodded slowly. "Makes sense. But Bozeman is Harrison's territory. Risky for you to show up there." Ms. Reynolds suggested meeting at her lake house outside the city. Less chance of being spotted. Abigail's eyes met his, determination shining through her fatigue. "I'm tired of running, Ethan. Tired of looking over my shoulder. If there's a legal way to stop Harrison, I need to find it." Ethan studied her for a moment before nodding. "All right, we'll go together. But first, we need to make sure the ranch is secure while we're gone." They spent the day implementing improved security measures. Miguel agreed to sleep in the bunkhouse rather than returning to his home in town, giving them an extra set of eyes on the property. They set up motion sensor lights around the barn and house, and Ethan showed Abigail how to use his old hunting rifle, just in case. "I'm not much for guns," she admitted as they stood at the edge of the property, Ethan positioning her hands on the weapon. "Neither am I, outside of necessity," he replied, his chest against her back as he guided her aim toward an old can on a fence post. "But out here, sometimes they're needed, not just for predators on 4 legs. The rifle cracked, and the can flew off the post. Abigail lowered the weapon, a small smile of satisfaction crossing her face. "Good shot," Ethan praised, trying to ignore the warmth that spread through him at their proximity. "You're a natural." "Hardly," she laughed, handing the rifle back. "But I appreciate the vote of confidence." That evening, as they packed overnight bags for the Bozeman trip, Ethan found himself unusually anxious. It wasn't just concern about leaving the ranch vulnerable, though that weighed on him. It was the prospect of taking this next step with Abigail, of officially aligning himself with her against Harrison. It made their connection real in a way it hadn't been before. No longer just 2 strangers thrown together by circumstance, but partners facing a common enemy. The thought both terrified and exhilarated him. Abigail seemed to sense his unease as they sat on the porch after dinner, watching the sun set behind the mountains. "You don't have to come tomorrow," she said softly. "This is my fight, not yours." Ethan shook his head. "If Harrison is connected to the sabotage at the ranch, it became my fight the moment you walked up my driveway." He turned to face her, his expression serious. And even if he isn't, I wouldn't let you face him alone." The gratitude in her eyes made something catch in his chest. For so long, he'd been the lone wolf, convinced he needed no one. Now he couldn't imagine not being there for her when she needed him. "Besides," he added with a hint of a smile, "who else is going to keep Midnight in line while you're gone? That Colt only listens to you." Their journey to Bozeman the next morning began before dawn, both of them tense but determined. Abigail clutched a leather satchel containing her father's research journals, the physical proof of her claims against Harrison. Ethan drove with one eye on the rearview mirror, watchful for any sign of pursuit. The lake house was nestled among pines on the shores of Highlight Reservoir, far enough from the main road to offer privacy. Carolyn Reynolds met them at the door, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s with silver hair cut in a no-nonsense bob. "Abigail," she greeted, embracing the younger woman. "I was so worried when I heard Harrison had reported you missing." Her gaze shifted to Ethan, assessing. "And you must be Mr. Blackwood." "Ethan," he corrected, shaking her offered hand. Inside, over coffee at a sunlit dining table overlooking the water, Abigail laid out her case. The research journals, Harrison's attempts to gain control, the threatened guardianship. "He's claiming I'm unstable with grief," she explained, her voice steady despite the hurt behind the words, "using my father's death against me to gain control of his life's work." Caroline listened attentively, making occasional notes. When Abigail finished, she turned to Ethan. "And the incidents at your ranch? You believe they're connected to Harrison's pursuit of Abigail?" Ethan nodded. "The timing is suspicious. The sabotage escalated shortly after Harrison arrived in the area. But why would he target your ranch specifically?" Caroline pressed. "That's what I can't figure," Ethan admitted, "unless he somehow knew Abigail was there before the sheriff mentioned it." Caroline's brow furrowed in thought. "Harrison Wells has many connections, but I doubt rural Montana ranching is among his areas of interest." She turned back to Abigail. "Your father's research, you mentioned it focused on equine respiratory diseases, yes. Specifically, a treatment protocol for horses with chronic conditions that traditional medicine couldn't help." Abigail opened one of the journals, pointing to a series of chemical formulations. "He developed a compound that showed remarkable success in clinical trials." "And the potential market value?" "Millions, possibly," Abigail admitted, "but Dad never cared about that. He wanted it accessible to all horse owners, not just the wealthy." Caroline nodded thoughtfully. "Harrison would see it differently. To him it would be a commodity to exploit." She closed her notebook decisively. "Here's what we're going to do. First, we file a counterpetition against Harrison's guardianship claim, using these journals as evidence of your competence and his true motives." "Will that be enough?" Ethan asked. "It's a start," Caroline replied. "But we also need to understand why he's targeting your ranch, Mr. Blackwood. That could be key to undermining his position." As they prepared to leave, Caroline pulled Abigail aside for a private word, leaving Ethan on the deck overlooking the lake. The peaceful scene contrasted sharply with the turmoil of their situation. But for the first time in weeks, he felt they had a direction, a plan beyond simply reacting to threats. On the drive back to the ranch, Abigail was quieter than usual, her gaze fixed on the passing landscape. Ethan gave her space, understanding she had much to process. It wasn't until they were nearly home that she broke the silence. "Caroline thinks I should file for full ownership of my father's practice and research," she said, her fingers tracing the outline of the journals in her lap. "Challenge Harrison directly instead of just defending against his claims." "That sounds right," Ethan replied, glancing at her. "It's your inheritance after all." "It would mean staying in Montana," Abigail continued, her voice careful. "At least until the legal battle is resolved, which could take months." Ethan's heart quickened, though he kept his expression neutral. "The ranch could use your help for as long as you're willing to stay," he said, trying to keep his tone light. "Midnight would miss you something terrible if you left now." "Just Midnight?" Abigail asked softly, turning to look at him directly. The vulnerability in her question caught him off guard. Ethan pulled the truck to the side of the road, putting it in park before facing her fully. "No," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. "Not just midnight. These past weeks, having you at the ranch, working together." He struggled to find the right words. "You've brought something back to that place that I thought was gone forever." Abigail's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "What's that?" "Hope," Ethan said simply. "A reason to fight for it, not just survive day to day." The moment hung between them, charged with possibilities neither had dared acknowledge until now. Slowly, Abigail reached across the seat, her hand finding his where it rested on the gear shift. "Then I'll stay," she whispered. "For as long as you want me to." Ethan's fingers intertwined with hers, calluses meeting softness in a grip that felt like a promise. They remained that way for a long moment, the silence between them more eloquent than words. Their newfound understanding was tested the moment they returned to Blackwood Ranch. Miguel met them at the gate, his expression grim. "Someone cut the fence in the east pasture," he reported as they climbed out of the truck. "Lost 20 head of cattle before we noticed. And there's something else. Sheriff Dawson came by with some papers. Said it was urgent you call him." Ethan's jaw tightened as he took the envelope Miguel handed him. Inside was a formal notice from the county courthouse. "Property dispute," he read aloud, his voice hardening. "Someone's filed a claim against my water rights." "Who?" Abigail asked, leaning close to read over his shoulder. "Horizon Development Corporation." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "Never heard of them." "There's a hearing date," Abigail pointed out. "Next week." "Convenient timing," Ethan muttered. "Just when we're already dealing with Harrison and the bank deadline." They headed to the house, where Ethan immediately called Sheriff Dawson. The conversation was brief but revelatory. Horizon Development was a recently formed company with plans to build a luxury resort in the valley. Without water rights, their project would be dead in the water, literally. "And guess who's listed as their legal counsel?" Ethan said as he hung up, his expression thunderous. "Harrison Wells." The pieces suddenly fell into place. Harrison's pursuit of Abigail had led him to Blackwood Ranch, where he discovered an opportunity too perfect to pass up. By helping Horizon Development secure Ethan's water rights, he could simultaneously eliminate Abigail's sanctuary and position himself favorably with powerful clients. "So the sabotage, the cattle poisoning," Abigail began, "all meant to push me into financial ruin before the bank's deadline," Ethan finished. "Make it impossible for me to fight the water rights claim." Abigail's expression hardened with resolve. "We're not going to let that happen." The next week was a whirlwind of activity. During the days, they worked tirelessly to document the sabotage incidents, gathering evidence for both the water rights hearing and Caroline's case against Harrison. At night, they pored over legal documents and Ethan's property deeds, searching for any advantage. Through it all, their connection deepened. What had begun as a partnership of necessity was evolving into something neither had expected to find. They moved in sync around the ranch, anticipating each other's needs, drawing strength from each other's presence. On the eve of the water rights hearing, they sat at the kitchen table surrounded by papers, both exhausted but determined. Ethan watched as Abigail bent over a property map, tracing the watershed with her finger, her brow furrowed in concentration. The sight stirred something profound in him, a feeling he'd almost forgotten was possible. "I think I found something," Abigail said suddenly, looking up with excitement. "Your grandfather's original deed includes mineral rights to the eastern ridge. According to Montana water law, that gives you priority rights to any water flowing through those minerals." Ethan leaned closer, examining where she was pointing. "Are you sure?" "Carolyn confirmed it this afternoon," Abigail replied, her eyes bright with triumph. "Horizon can challenge your surface water rights all they want, but they can't touch the mineral-associated water rights. They're ironclad." Relief and admiration washed over Ethan in equal measure. "You're remarkable, you know that?" he said softly. Abigail blushed, glancing down at the map. "I just want to help. This ranch, it's become important to me." "Just the ranch?" Ethan asked, echoing her question from days earlier. Her eyes met his, vulnerable yet certain. "No, not just the ranch. The admission hung between them, charged with potential. Slowly, Ethan reached across the table, brushing a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering against her cheek. Abigail leaned into his touch, her eyes never leaving his. "Abigail," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "I never expected." The moment was shattered by the sound of breaking glass. They both jumped up as the kitchen window exploded inward, shards spraying across the floor. A rock lay amid the debris, a note wrapped around it. "Get out while you still can." Ethan read, his expression darkening. Last warning. Before either could react, the barn alarm they'd installed began to wail. Followed by the panicked sounds of horses in distress, through the broken window they could see flames beginning to lick at the barn roof. "Midnight!" Abigail gasped, already moving toward the door. "Wait," Ethan caught her arm. "We go together. Stay close to me." They raced to the barn where smoke was billowing from the hayloft. Inside, the horses were frantic, kicking at their stalls as flames spread across the ceiling. Miguel arrived moments later, having heard the alarm from the bunkhouse. "Get the horses out," Ethan ordered, grabbing a fire extinguisher from the wall. "I'll try to contain it until the fire department arrives." Abigail headed straight for Midnight's stall, where the young Colt was rearing in terror. "Easy, boy," she soothed, her voice calm despite the chaos around them. "We're going to get you out of here." One by one, they led the panicked horses to safety, releasing them into the paddock away from the burning barn. Ethan fought the flames with grim determination, knowing they had only minutes before the entire structure would be engulfed. Abigail was leading the last mare out when a burning beam crashed down behind her, blocking the exit. Smoke filled the air, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. "Abigail!" Ethan shouted, his heart seizing with fear. "Where are you?" "Near the tack room," she called back, her voice muffled by the roar of the fire. "I can't get through." Ethan handed the extinguisher to Miguel and rushed back into the burning barn, using his shirt to cover his mouth against the acrid smoke. He found Abigail cornered between advancing flames and a frightened horse, trying desperately to calm the animal enough to lead it to safety. "This way," he called, spotting a narrow path along the wall where the fire hadn't yet reached. "Stay low." Together, they guided the terrified mare through the smoke, emerging into the cool night air, just as the barn roof began to collapse. They stumbled to the paddock where the other horses were gathered, both coughing and covered in soot. "Are you hurt?" Ethan demanded, his hands gently checking her for injuries. "I'm okay," Abigail assured him, though her voice was hoarse from the smoke. "The horses?" "All accounted for," Miguel confirmed, leading Midnight over to them. The Colt nuzzled Abigail anxiously, as if assuring himself she was unharmed. In the distance, sirens wailed as the Pine Ridge Volunteer Fire Department approached. Ethan pulled Abigail close, his arm protectively around her shoulders as they watched the barn, built by his father decades ago, succumb to the flames. "They're escalating," he said grimly. "First sabotage, then threats, now arson." Abigail leaned into him, drawing and giving comfort simultaneously. "They're desperate," she corrected, "because we're close to stopping them." The fire department arrived moments later, but it was too late to save the barn. They focused instead on preventing the fire from spreading to nearby structures. Working through the night to ensure the flames were fully extinguished, Sheriff Dawson appeared as dawn was breaking, surveying the charred remains with a grim expression. "This goes beyond vandalism or sabotage," he told Ethan. "This is criminal arson. I'm opening a formal investigation." "We know who's behind it," Ethan replied, handing over the threatening note they'd received. "Harrison Wells and Horizon Development." "Accusations need evidence," the sheriff cautioned. "But I'll look into any connections." He studied Ethan's exhausted face. "What about the water rights hearing today? You still planning to attend?" "We'll be there," Abigail answered firmly before Ethan could speak. "They're trying to scare us away because they know we can win." After the sheriff left, Ethan and Abigail retreated to the house to clean up and prepare for the hearing. Despite their exhaustion and the devastation of the barn loss, a new determination had taken hold. This was no longer just about protecting the ranch or Abigail's inheritance. It was about standing against those who would use intimidation and destruction to get their way. I should have taken the threats more seriously, Ethan said as they sat at the kitchen table, now cleared of glass and debris. Put more security in place. We both did what we could, Abigail replied, reaching for his hand. And no one was hurt. That's what matters. Ethan's fingers tightened around hers. When I couldn't find you in that smoke. He trailed off, the memory still raw. I realized something. What? Abigail asked softly. That losing this ranch would be hard, but losing you would be unbearable. The admission cost him. A man unaccustomed to revealing his heart, but the night's events had stripped away his usual reserve. I know you came here by chance, and your plans were always to move on, but... My plans have changed, Abigail interrupted gently. I thought I was just passing through, finding temporary shelter. But what I found instead... She took a deep breath. What I found was a place where I belong. With the horses, with this land, with you. The simple truth of her words washed over Ethan like a cleansing rain, washing away years of isolation and resignation. In this woman who had appeared on his doorstep with nothing but determination and skill, he had found not just a partner for his struggling ranch, but a companion for the life he'd stopped believing he could have. From today, he said, his voice rough with emotion, you run this ranch with me, not as my guest or my helper, but as my partner, in everything. The proposal was unplanned, unpolished, and utterly sincere. Abigail's eyes filled with tears, but her smile was radiant. Nothing would make me happier, she whispered. Nothing in the world. In the midst of destruction and uncertainty, surrounded by the aftermath of those who sought to drive them apart, they found themselves drawn inexorably together. Ethan leaned forward, his hand cradling her cheek with surprising gentleness for a man whose life had been defined by harsh elements and hard work. Their first kiss tasted of smoke and promise, of endings and beginnings intertwined. When they finally pulled apart, something new shone in both their eyes. Not just determination to face the challenges ahead, but certainty that whatever came, they would face it together. We should get ready for the hearing, Abigail said eventually, though she made no move to release his hand. Ethan nodded, rising and pulling her to her feet beside him. Let's go show Harrison and Horizon Development who they're really dealing with. As they prepared to leave, Ethan paused to look back at the ranch. The charred skeleton of the barn stood starkly against the morning sky, a reminder of what they had already lost. But beside it, the horses grazed peacefully in the paddock. Midnight among them, his injured leg nearly healed. The house still stood, weathered but strong. And beside him stood Abigail, a woman who had saved more than just a colt on that stormy night weeks ago. She had saved Blackwood Ranch. And in doing so, had saved him too. The Pine Ridge County Courthouse stood like an island of order amid the chaos of their lives, its limestone facade gleaming in the morning sunlight. Ethan and Abigail climbed the steps together, both exhausted from the night's ordeal but fortified by their shared resolve. The smell of smoke still clung to their clothes despite their best efforts to clean up, a tangible reminder of what was at stake. Inside, the hearing room was already filled with curious locals. News of the Blackwood Ranch fire had spread quickly through the small community, adding an electric undercurrent to the proceedings. Ethan spotted several neighboring ranchers who had come to show support, nodding gratefully in their direction. At the front of the room, a team of suited lawyers huddled around a distinguished-looking man Ethan recognized from town meetings as Richard Keller, CEO of Horizon Development. And beside them, looking smug and completely unsurprised by their disheveled appearance, stood Harrison Wells. He knew about the fire, Abigail whispered, her hand tightening around the folder containing their evidence. Look at his face. He was expecting us not to show up. Ethan's jaw clenched as he guided her to their table, where Caroline Reynolds was already waiting. The attorney took in their appearance with a sharp eye, leaning close as they sat down. What happened? She asked under her breath. Barn fire, Ethan replied tersely. Total loss. Everyone's safe, but it was deliberate. Caroline's expression hardened. We can use that. The timing is too convenient to ignore. Before they could discuss further, the bailiff called the room to order as Judge Eleanor Martinez entered. In her 60s, with steel-gray hair and penetrating eyes that seemed to miss nothing, she had a reputation for fairness and zero tolerance for legal games. This hearing concerns the water rights dispute between Horizon Development Corporation and Blackwood Ranch, she announced, scanning the documents before her. I understand there was an incident at Blackwood Ranch last night? Yes, Your Honor. Caroline rose smoothly. A fire destroyed the main barn. The sheriff has opened an arson investigation. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Judge Martinez frowned, looking over her glasses at the Horizon legal team. Interesting timing. Given today's hearing, let's proceed. But I'll note the incident for the record. For the next hour, Horizon's attorneys presented their case, arguing that the water rights claimed by Blackwood Ranch exceeded historical usage and should be partially reallocated to support regional economic development. Their presentation was slick, filled with economic projections and promises of jobs and prosperity the resort would bring to Pine Ridge County. Throughout their testimony, Harrison remained silent but watchful, his eyes frequently drifting to Abigail, with a calculating expression that made Ethan's protective instincts flare. When Harrison finally took the stand as Horizon's legal counsel, his smooth voice filled the room with practiced persuasion. We're not asking Mr. Blackwood to give up his livelihood, Harrison assured the judge, merely to share resources that are currently underutilized. The resort will bring much-needed economic revival to this struggling region. And what about the struggling ranch that's been in the Blackwood family for generations? Caroline countered during cross-examination. How is Mr. Blackwood supposed to maintain his cattle operation with reduced water access? Harrison's smile was practiced and patronizing. Perhaps Mr. Blackwood should consider whether a failing cattle operation is the best use of his land. Horizon would be willing to discuss purchasing the property at a very generous price. A ripple of disapproval ran through the local ranchers in attendance. Judge Martinez frowned but allowed the testimony to continue. When it was their turn to present, Caroline called Ethan to the stand first. Despite his exhaustion, he spoke clearly about his family's long history on the land, the recent sabotage incidents, and the connections they'd uncovered between Harrison and Horizon. We believe the water rights challenge is part of a coordinated effort to force me off my land, Ethan stated, meeting Harrison's gaze directly. First through sabotage, then through legal channels, and finally through direct intimidation. Objection, Your Honor, Harrison rose smoothly. These are serious accusations without evidence. I have evidence, Ethan replied before the judge could rule. Sheriff Dawson has documented every incident at my ranch over the past 6 months. The pattern and timing are clear. Judge Martinez allowed the testimony but cautioned Ethan to stick to facts rather than speculation about motives. When Caroline introduced the mineral rights documentation Abigail had discovered, however, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted perceptibly. According to Montana water law, Caroline explained, displaying the original deed, mineral rights established in 1891 grant Blackwood Ranch priority water access regardless of usage patterns. This supersedes any claim Horizon might make based on alleged underutilization. Harrison's composed facade cracked slightly as he conferred urgently with his team. Judge Martinez studied the documents with careful attention, occasionally asking clarifying questions that suggested she found the argument compelling. When Abigail took the stand, Ethan watched Harrison's expression darken. She spoke clearly about her background as a veterinarian's daughter, her work at Blackwood Ranch, and her professional assessment of the ranch's water needs. But it was when Caroline directed the questioning toward Harrison that the real confrontation began. Ms. Foster, do you have any prior connection to Mr. Wells? Caroline asked. Yes, Abigail replied steadily. Harrison Wells was my father's business partner. After my father's death, he attempted to gain control of his veterinary practice and research through manipulation and false claims about my mental state. Harrison was on his feet immediately. Objection. This is completely irrelevant to the water rights case. On the contrary, Caroline countered, it establishes a pattern of Mr. Wells using legal maneuvers to gain control of assets he covets, whether they're medical patents or ranch water rights. Judge Martinez allowed the testimony to continue, her shrewd gaze moving between Abigail and Harrison. Miss Foster, do you have documentation of these claims? Yes, Your Honor. Abigail indicated the journals and legal papers they had brought. My father's research journals detail his work and his intentions for it after his death. There are also letters explicitly stating he did not wish Harrison to have control of his practice. As the hearing progressed, Harrison became increasingly agitated, especially when Caroline introduced evidence connecting him to Horizon weeks before he claimed to have begun representing them. The timeline suggested he had targeted the ranch after discovering Abigail's presence there, seeing an opportunity to pursue both objectives simultaneously. "Your Honor," Harrison finally interrupted, his composure slipping. "Miss Foster is a disturbed young woman still grieving her father's death. Her accusations are the product of paranoia, not reality." "Interesting assessment from someone who claims he's just Horizon's lawyer," Judge Martinez observed dryly. "You seem unusually invested in Ms. Foster's credibility for someone with no personal connection to this case." By the time final arguments concluded, the mood in the courtroom had shifted decisively. Judge Martinez called a brief recess to review the evidence before rendering her decision, leaving Ethan and Abigail to wait anxiously in the courthouse corridor. "You were amazing in there," Ethan told Abigail, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear with gentle fingers. "We both were," she replied, leaning slightly into his touch, "but it's not over yet." Carolyn joined them, her expression cautiously optimistic. The mineral rights argument was solid, and Harrison did himself no favors by attacking you personally, Abigail. It only reinforced the connection between the two cases. When court resumed 30 minutes later, Judge Martinez delivered her ruling with decisive clarity. "Based on the evidence presented, I find that Blackwood Ranch's water rights are legally protected by the original mineral rights deed of 1891. Horizon Development's petition for reallocation is denied." She paused, looking directly at Harrison. "Furthermore, I am referring this matter to the county prosecutor for investigation into possible collusion and criminal intimidation." Relief washed over Ethan like a physical force. Beside him, Abigail squeezed his hand so tightly he could feel her trembling. They had won this battle, but both knew the war was far from over. Outside the courthouse, reporters from the local paper gathered around them, eager for statements about both the water rights decision and the barn fire. Ethan kept his comments measured, thanking the community for their support and expressing determination to rebuild. It wasn't until they were walking back to his truck that Harrison intercepted them, his face flushed with barely controlled anger. "This isn't over," he said quietly, stepping directly into their path. "That ruling only protected your water rights. It didn't address Abigail's delusions or her theft of research that rightfully belongs to the practice." "My father's research belongs to me," Abigail replied, her voice steady despite the tension visible in her shoulders. "And the only delusion here is your belief that you can intimidate us into giving up." Harrison's gaze shifted to Ethan. "You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into, Blackwood. One little victory in a county courthouse won't save your pathetic ranch. There are larger forces at work than you can possibly understand." "Is that a threat?" Ethan asked, stepping slightly forward, positioning himself between Harrison and Abigail. "It's a reality check." Harrison sneered. "Enjoy your moment while it lasts." As he turned to leave, Sheriff Dawson approached, having witnessed the exchange from nearby. "Everything all right here?" "Just fine, Sheriff," Ethan replied, not taking his eyes off Harrison's retreating figure. Mr. Wells was just leaving. The drive back to the ranch was quiet, both of them processing the day's events and Harrison's parting words. The victory felt significant, but somehow incomplete, as if they'd won a skirmish while the larger battle loomed ahead. The ranch came into view just as the sun was beginning to set, painting the mountains with golden light. The charred remains of the barn stood as a stark reminder of what they were fighting against, that the house remained, sturdy and defiant. The horses grazed peacefully in the paddock, Midnight among them, his coat gleaming in the fading light. "Home," Abigail said softly as Ethan parked the truck. The simple word carried such weight that Ethan had to take a moment before responding. "Yes," he agreed finally. Home. Inside, they found Miguel and several neighboring ranchers waiting. Word of their victory had spread quickly, and the community had rallied. The kitchen table was laden with food, and outside, pickup trucks were unloading lumber and supplies. "We figured you'd need help rebuilding," explained Frank Dawson, the sheriff's brother and owner of the neighboring Triple D Ranch. Thought we'd get a head start." "We can't possibly accept," Ethan began, overwhelmed by the gesture. "Sure you can," Frank interrupted. "That's how it works out here. Today it's your barn, tomorrow it might be my fence line or Jim's cattle. We take care of our own." For a man who had grown accustomed to facing every challenge alone, the support was almost too much to process. Ethan felt a tightness in his throat as he shook Frank's hand. "Thank you," he managed. "All of you." The impromptu gathering turned into an informal planning session for the barn raising, with experienced ranchers offering suggestions and volunteering specific skills. By the time everyone left, a schedule had been established, with work to begin the following morning. "I can't believe how quickly everyone came together," Abigail said as she and Ethan stood on the porch, watching the last trucks depart. "In just a few hours, they organized what would have taken us weeks to plan." "That's Pine Ridge," Ethan replied, a newfound appreciation for his community warming his voice. "We may be spread out across the valley, but when it matters, distance doesn't count." As they turned to go inside, Ethan caught Abigail's hand, drawing her gently to a stop. In the soft porch light, her face showed every emotion of the tumultuous day: exhaustion, relief, lingering worry, and something deeper that mirrored what he felt growing in his own heart. "Thank you," he said simply, "for finding midnight that night, for staying, for fighting alongside me today." "I should be thanking you," Abigail countered softly. "You took in a stranger, protected me, risked everything to help me stand against Harrison." Ethan shook his head. "You saved more than a Colt that night, Abigail. You saved this ranch. You saved me from giving up." His hand rose to cup her cheek. "You gave me something to fight for beyond just surviving another season." The kiss they shared was deeper than their first, unhurried despite their exhaustion, a tender affirmation of everything that had been said and much that remained unspoken. When they finally separated, Abigail rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "What do we do now?" she asked. "About Harrison? The ranch? Everything?" "We rebuild," Ethan answered, his arms tightening around her. "One day at a time. Starting with that barn." The barn raising began at dawn the next morning, with trucks and volunteers arriving before the sun had fully cleared the mountains. Men who had spent their lives building fences and mending roofs moved with practiced efficiency, mapping out the foundation on the cleared side of the old barn. Ethan worked alongside them, his muscles protesting after the sleepless night, but his spirit buoyed by the community effort. Abigail organized food and drinks for the workers with the help of several ranchers' wives, but frequently joined the construction, her practical knowledge of what the animals needed, ensuring the new barn would be even better than the original. By midday, the frame was taking shape, a skeletal promise rising from the ashes of destruction. Sheriff Dawson stopped by, pulling Ethan aside for a private word. "Forensics confirmed it was arson," he said, keeping his voice low. "Accelerant was poured in multiple locations. This wasn't opportunistic. It was planned." "Any evidence pointing to who did it?" Ethan asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Nothing concrete yet," the sheriff admitted. "But I've been looking into Horizon Development like you suggested. Their funding is interesting. Primary investor is a medical research company called Wells Pharmaceuticals." "Harrison," Ethan breathed. "It's all connected." "Seems that way," Sheriff Dawson agreed. "I've requested more information about both companies. Meanwhile, I'll have deputies drive by regularly. Keep an eye on things." As the sheriff left, Ethan found Abigail working with Midnight in the paddock, using gentle exercises to continue strengthening his injured leg. The Colt had made remarkable progress under her care, his movement almost normal now. "Sheriff confirmed it was arson," he told her, leaning on the fence. "And Harrison's company is the primary investor in Horizon Development." Abigail nodded, unsurprised. "Caroline called while you were working. She's filed for an emergency injunction against Harrison's guardianship petition, citing his conflicts of interest and evidence of harassment." "That's good news, right?" "It buys us time," Abigail replied cautiously. "But Harrison has resources and connections we can only guess at. He won't give up easily." Ethan's gaze traveled to the half-built barn, where men who had been strangers to him just months ago now worked together to rebuild what had been destroyed. "Neither will we." The barn raising continued for 3 days, the structure rising steadily from dawn to dusk each day. What might have taken Ethan weeks to accomplish alone was achieved through the collective effort of neighbors who understood the value of community in this harsh but beautiful landscape. On the afternoon of the third day, as the roof was being completed, Ethan stood back to appreciate the transformation. The new barn was larger and sturdier than the original, with improved ventilation and a more efficient layout. Something good had emerged from the destruction, a metaphor that wasn't lost on him. Abigail joined him, handing him a glass of lemonade. "It's beautiful," she said, following his gaze. "Your father would be proud." "Our barn now," Ethan corrected gently. "Our ranch." The simple declaration brought a glow to Abigail's face that rivaled the setting sun. Before she could respond, Frank Dawson called for everyone's attention, standing on a hay bale with a raised hammer. "Traditional barn raising calls for a ceremony when the last beam goes up," he announced to the gathered workers. "Ethan, Abigail, you should do the honors." Surrounded by their neighbors, they climbed to where the final roof beam waited. Together they positioned it while Frank handed Ethan a hammer and nails that had been passed down through generations of Dawsons for just such occasions. "These nails have held up every barn in this valley since my great-grandfather's day," Frank explained, supposed to bring good fortune to the new structure. As Ethan drove the first nail, a cheer went up from the gathered ranchers. He handed the hammer to Abigail, who drove the second nail with surprising strength, earning another round of applause. The simple ritual forged another bond between them, another shared moment in the story they were building together. That evening, after the workers had departed with promises to return for a proper barn warming once the interior was finished, Ethan and Abigail sat on the porch swing surveying their transformed property. The new barn stood proudly against the twilight sky, a testament to resilience and community. "I've been thinking," Ethan said, his arm comfortably around Abigail's shoulders, "about what you said regarding your father's research. What about it? You mentioned it was for treating equine respiratory diseases, making treatment affordable for all horse owners." He gestured toward the pasture where their horses grazed. "What if we integrated that into the ranch? Not just raising cattle, but breeding and rehabilitating horses, using your father's methods." Abigail straightened, her eyes widening as she considered the possibility. "A specialized equine rehabilitation center? Here." "Why not? You have the knowledge, I have the land and facilities. We'd need to expand, of course, build proper treatment areas, but—" He trailed off, suddenly uncertain. "It's just an idea. A way to honor your father's work and create something new here." "It's brilliant." Abigail breathed, her mind clearly racing with possibilities. "We could help horses that traditional veterinary practices have given up on. Create a sanctuary where they can heal. And a sustainable business model for the ranch," Ethan added. "Less vulnerable to drought than cattle alone." They spent the next hour excitedly developing the concept, sketching ideas on the back of an envelope Ethan found in his pocket. By the time they finally went inside, a new vision for Blackwood Ranch had taken shape, one that combined their skills and passions in a way neither could have imagined when Abigail first appeared with an injured colt. The following weeks brought both progress and challenges. The barn was completed, and work began on converting part of it into treatment stalls for future rehabilitation cases. Word of their plan spread through the ranching community, bringing offers of support and even potential clients with horses that needed specialized care. Harrison, meanwhile, had not given up his pursuit. Though the emergency injunction had temporarily halted his guardianship petition, his lawyers filed motion after motion, each requiring Caroline's response and Abigail's attention. The legal battle drained resources they could ill afford to spare, but neither was willing to concede. One evening, as Ethan returned from checking the cattle in the north pasture, he found Abigail sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by legal papers, her expression troubled. "What's wrong?" he asked, hanging his hat by the door. "Harrison's latest filing," she replied, pushing a document toward him. "He's claiming my father was mentally incompetent when he made me the beneficiary of his estate. Says there's medical evidence." Ethan scanned the document, his jaw tightening. "Can he do that?" "Caroline says it's a desperate move, but we'll need to fight it." Abigail rubbed her temples wearily. which means more legal fees, more time in court instead of here building what we've started. Seeing her distress, Ethan made a decision. Moving to the old roll-top desk in the corner, he retrieved a small key from his pocket and unlocked a hidden drawer. From it, he withdrew a weathered envelope. "I was saving this," he said, returning to the table, "for when things got really desperate with the bank. Looks like that time is now." He placed the envelope before her. Inside was a deed to a small parcel of land near the eastern boundary of the ranch, separate from the main property. "My grandfather bought this piece separately, years after establishing the ranch," Ethan explained. "It's not large, just 20 acres, but it contains something valuable. A natural hot spring with mineral properties." He kept it quiet, worried the government might claim it as a public resource. Abigail looked up from the deed, confusion in her eyes. "How does this help us? The spring has never been developed or officially documented. Its mineral content hasn't been analyzed by modern methods." Ethan sat beside her, taking her hands in his. "But my grandfather swore it had healing properties. He used the water for his horses, said it cured ailments nothing else could touch." Understanding dawned in Abigail's expression. "You think it could be connected to my father's research? A natural source of the compounds he was synthesizing?" "It's worth investigating," Ethan replied. "And even if it's not, the spring itself has value. We could sell a portion of the rights to raise money for your legal battle while retaining enough for our rehabilitation center." The potential of this hidden resource energized them both. The following day, they visited the spring, a serene pool nestled in a small canyon, its waters steaming slightly in the cool mountain air. Abigail collected samples to send to a laboratory Caroline recommended, while Ethan mapped the area, calculating how much they might safely sell without compromising their future plans. As they worked side by side, a new sense of possibility enveloped them. What had begun as a desperate struggle for survival, both of the ranch and of Abigail's independence, was evolving into something more visionary. A future neither could have imagined alone, but which seemed increasingly attainable together. That evening, standing together on the porch of what was now truly their home, watching the sunset paint the new barn with golden light, Ethan turned to Abigail with quiet certainty. "Marry me," he said simply. Not a question, but an invitation to the future they were building. Abigail's smile bloomed slowly, like the first wildflowers after winter's retreat. "Yes," she answered, just as simply. "Yes, to everything we're creating here." Their kiss sealed more than a promise between two people who had found each other against impossible odds. It affirmed a partnership forged through adversity, a vision born from separate dreams now intertwined, and a determination to transform loss into new beginnings. The injured colt that had brought them together now grazed contentedly in the pasture below, his recovery a living symbol of the healing power of care and persistence. And in the dying light of day, Blackwood Ranch stood as it had for generations, weathered but unbowed, a testament to the enduring strength of those who worked its soil and cherished its legacy. Not just surviving, but thriving. Not just existing, but truly living. Together. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.